I think because the last group that we knew of that still had people in it was workforce development. So I think we're all back now. So we wanted to hear from each of the work groups how that went, just a brief report out. Laurel, since I can see you, do you mind going first?
Great, thanks. Sure. So we did a quick review of the executive summary so that we could see the recommendations that were pulled out from all of the groups. And then we were assigned to look at, we are the pediatric care group work group. We were assigned to look at the funding and alignment of performance measures work group. A question that I'll just pass on that came up as we were looking at the executive summary was, how were those specific recommendations selected? Because at least for the pediatric subgroup recommendations, we had quite a list of recommendations and only 2 were pulled up. So that was just a question of that nature. So then we did look at the funding and alignment of performance measures, which was a great summary of the different areas where performance measures are being tracked, and trying to look at also how things are funded in parity and all of that, and then the recommendations that came out of that one. I think an area that we talked about both as linkages and a potential opportunity was some thinking around shared measurement. And within the pediatric subgroup recommendations, we had talked about wanting to form a pretty broadly represented group to come together and really look at more population level, not just from a specific program, not just Medicaid or a certain entity, but what are the measures that help us understand how kids are doing, and as well as looking at a measure of integration. So the impacts, the integration kind of approach, and how is that impacting kids and how is that impacting their functioning. So our group would love to make a connection with the funding and alignment of performance measures group and just do some shared thinking around some of that. There was some interest in like a common scorecard, or just how are we talking about this? So that's one aspect. Also acknowledging, I think within their recommendations, it also talked about piloting integration models. And so there was just some questions that we had around, that there are some being piloted or have been underway for a while. And some alignment with our recommendation around, in some areas we have successes with some pilots, but we haven't had the resourcing or structure to really take those to a more systemic level, to do it more broadly across other settings where there's interest. So just wanting to think about, what is it that we take from pilots? How do we know what the lessons learned or the kind of recommendations are coming out of a pilot to then take it to that next level? And so that's some just thinking that would, again, kind of be interested in doing together. And then we talked some around that parity aspect, which I think the other group was talking about, doing a formal needs assessment around the parity of covered services or covered integration services. And we just talked about, from our group's membership lenses, where do we see or experience some parity challenges? And so there were some examples that pretty quickly came up. And so I think that's an area where there would, again, be some interest in kind of just sharing the perspectives and thinking across our 2 work groups, and how to best do that, I think, is the question. Is it small conversation between the facilitators? Is it actually bringing those 2 groups together? I think that's something that we'd be wanting to explore a little bit more. We didn't get to the last section of questions because those were actually already on our list for our subgroup around, what's the first action step? When are we going to do it? Like those kind of things. So we'll be tackling that next week.
Great. Thank you very much, Laurel. And those interim, what was pulled up top for those interim recommendations were really meant to be things, and they haven't, if you want to still adjust that, it was meant to pull out the things from the different work groups that seem to be the most representative, like an umbrella, because it's a summary. that in that first bit. It's just meant, it says summary of recommendations. And we're action oriented, with the full recommendations are down below. So if,
Kathy,
if you would like to adjust that. Yes, Dan?
you've lost me. I don't know what you're referring to. You're talking about a part of the report right now?
Oh,
Yes,
it's something
I'm
I had
sorry.
mentioned in the executive summary. It pulled up some recommendations from work groups, but for work groups who had more than 2 recommendations, it only extracted 2. And so our question was like, how were those selected? And honestly, Kathy, I think it might be helpful in the introduction of the interim recommendations within the executive summary to say these are excerpts or these are some of. It doesn't say that.
Okay.
It reads as if those are the only ones.
But I'm looking at the
Okay,
report.
great, thank you.
Kathy?
Yes,
Kathy? Yeah, sorry for interrupting again. I'm looking at the executive summary and there aren't any recommendations in the executive summary. There's a section at the end called recommendations.
that's what Laurel's referring to.
Okay.
Yeah, under where it says, and then the interim.
Yeah.
So,
the
thank you,
recommendation-
Laurel.
Go ahead,
Sorry, Dan, what was that?